The actress Meryl Streep once said that motherhood has a very humanising effect. Everything gets reduced to the essentials. The essentials, of course, being a cup of tea and a biscuit. Welcome to the Mummafesto, the podcast where parenting and politics combine. I'm Stella Creasy, a backbench Labour MP and mum to 2 young kids. My guest this week is the author and researcher Alex Bollen. Formerly research director at Ipsos MORI, Alex has recently published her first book, Motherhood, Breaking Free from Bad Science and Good Mother Myths, exploring how motherhood has been weaponised by science and the state, and the inherently political nature of motherhood. Alex, welcome to the Mummafesto. Alex, thank you so much for joining me on the Mummafesto this week. Isn't everybody actually a bad mum by certainly the Daily Mail's standard?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's impossible to be a good mother, particularly from the perspective of the Daily Mail, which seems to enjoy taking pot shots at women for all sorts of bad behaviour. But it's impossible to be a good mother. The standards are so high, and it's so very, very easy to be a bad mother, as you yourself have found, on many occasions, thanks to the media.
Oh, frequently. Although I actually feel now more judged by my Instagram feed of all the craft activities and home-cooked food that I should be making for my kids. I have tried to make fritters several times, and my kids have been pretty consistent in their response to them. I ask you that because I think the premise of your work and the premise of what you've been doing will really strike a chord with lots of people listening to this about the way in which we talk about motherhood and how I don't think I was prepared actually when I finally became a mum, just how much extra judgment and shame was kind of already being ladled on. I thought it might just be about, getting my pre-baby bod back. But actually, our concepts of motherhood in society are extraordinarily negative. Just tell us a bit about how you came to do the research that you're doing and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so it kind of has its roots in when I became a mother, because I had exactly that experience. I wanted to be a good mother and just found that I felt like a terrible mother for all sorts of reasons. I had a really kind of rocky start to motherhood, problems with breastfeeding, colicky baby, felt like I'd sort of ruined my life. And that inspired me.
You mean you didn't match all the outfits of your kids? What? Shame on you. Shame on you.
I felt like I couldn't, exactly. Yeah, getting dressed felt like a challenge, let alone kind of getting showered. And then I sort of came to realise why early parenthood is so difficult, and that inspired me to train with the NCT as a postnatal practitioner, which is work I've been doing for over a decade, and I love doing it. And I'd kind of, sort of sit in these postnatal groups and hear women sort of beat themselves up for, oh, I've had a shower, or I spent sort of 5 minutes putting some lipstick on, and just how harshly people judge themselves. And so I kind of wanted to sort of unpick that and understand, where does this pressure come from? Because I think there's a lot of pressure from society, but I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as well. I think that they're kind of, sort of mutually reinforcing. So I wanted to understand that, and why we so strongly want to be good mothers, and why we invariably fail at that. Another thing which happened to me personally, I think when my son was about 6 weeks old, I read a book called Why Love Matters, which is all about sort of how babies' brains develop. And I have to say, it nearly pushed me over the edge. It really made me sort of sink into a pit of despair, because I just thought, I'm damaging my baby's brain. It's like, oh, you must be, constantly responsive, and even sad faces can be, harmful for babies. And honestly, I could barely smile at the time, so I just thought, I'm damaging my baby in ways I can't even see, because I don't know what's going on in his head. And I remember having horrible dreams about him having a sort of gaping hole in his head where his brain should be. It was just, it was grim. And I wanted to sort of unpick all of that, and it didn't take me long to work out that a lot of what underpins all these things about we need to build our babies' brains is just based on such flimsy evidence. And that made me really, really cross. I'm a researcher, and I was working at Ipsos at the time, and we had and have quite strict rules in terms of what you can say about research and the conclusions you can draw. And I couldn't quite believe that all these parenting prescriptions were being dished out on the basis of such flimsy evidence. So that was what kind of drove me to write this book, and to really dig into what parents are told and what sits behind that.
So I think that's fascinating, and lots of people will be immediately thinking of all the things they've been told and all the different, put your baby down, don't put your baby down, make sure that you get into a routine early on, don't worry about routine. Like, it is overwhelming. I think it is an entirely human response, because this thing comes into your life that you want to do good by, and at the same time there's lots of conflicting information. Tell us some of your favourite baby myths, shall we say, because I think they're baby myths rather than motherhood myths.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely the case about sort of what babies need. I think the one which makes me the crossest, and which is the most pervasive potentially, is this idea that babies need to be built, and that we need to sort of sculpt our babies' brains, and we need to sort of consciously do things to develop them. And this idea that if we don't do this, then they're not going to grow. I mean, and if you kind of look at the expanse of human history, and I've looked at quite a lot of history in my book, if we were all having to give babies this kind of second by second attention, humans wouldn't have got very far. It's a very sort of modern thing, this idea that we have to be so responsive and constantly stimulate. I mean, babies are stimulated by life. That's the truth. Your baby will be happy going to, whether you take them to the supermarket or take them to, monkey music. Babies are stimulated by life. They're stimulated by people, and ordinary loving parenting is really all babies need. And there's lots of things that can get in the way of that, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But yeah.
So you mean the whole baby class thing and all the kind of things you're meant to be taking your child to is a con?
Yeah. Essentially. I mean, I'd say go to them if you want to go and get out of the house and meet people. That's a great reason for going to baby class. Stimulating your baby, it really doesn't make any difference at all. And all the things you can do in baby class, you can do at home, you can do with friends. I mean, I used to, when my kids were little, I used to love going to going to the library and rhyme time, but because it was a way to get out of the house and things to do with them, but it wasn't about, stimulating them. It was just about a nice thing to do with them. And I think if you just follow that, just do stuff with your baby you like doing, that's all you need to do, really.
Does that include watching Netflix? Because at the point when I first had my first child, I found the sleep deprivation so overwhelming that all I could do was kind of sit and watch trash telly.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, you're sitting there, you're holding your baby, they're sleeping on your chest, they're happy sleeping on your chest, you're happy watching Netflix, everyone wins.
Brilliant. So when you first started doing this research and you first started talking about this, what kind of reaction did you get? Because obviously we do get it drilled into us, I think, quite a lot, that, you must be doing things with your child. You must be giving them all that support to grow. The early years are a massively important period of time in a child's development. And as you say, that can be incredibly judgmental about what you ought to be doing, what you're not to be doing. What first reaction did you get when you started to talk about the counter to that?
I think relief. I think people are quite relieved, actually. It's kind of like...
Yes, I can watch more Netflix.
Exactly.
I can finish the series.
Yeah, exactly. Because we suck a lot of joy out of the parent. Because actually, I think parenting babies, parenting toddlers, it can be challenging and exhausting and frustrating, but it can also be joyful and wonderful. And I think this idea that we have to be sort of constantly stimulating or playing with them, because it can really suck a lot of the joy out of it. So it's kind of sort of making it lighter for people. And you sort of see people, and when I sort of say to people like this, you mentioned routine, whether or not you should have a routine. There's so much moralizing about baby sleep. And if you say to people, actually, there's no evidence that shows any difference between babies who've had a routine or not had a routine, or co-slept or not co-slept, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Just do what works for you. Then you're just giving people permission to enjoy their babies and find their own way of doing things.
I mean, this is revolutionary talk in a world where I remember somebody being totally shocked that one of my children was awake past 7 o'clock in the evening. I was thinking, like, you try it. You try getting them to go to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like, and there's all sorts of reasons why, your baby might be awake beyond 7 and you're happy. And that's actually a real kind of UK US thing, the idea that babies go to bed at 7. You go to Spain, babies are not going to bed at 7 because the culture there is very different. And that's fine. I mean, babies are so flexible and adaptable. And that's why there is no one right, inverted commas, way. Because as humans, we're designed to be adaptable and to thrive in many different environments.
So, Alex, just talk us through then. Where do you think these myths come from?
Um, I think that's a really interesting question, and that was something I really wanted to unpick in my book. So I've kind of, I call them, good mother myths, and they tend to be sort of fashioned by the experts of a particular era. So I've sort of gone back in time and looked at when experts were saying, you must have your baby in a regular routine, and they mustn't wake up or have any feeds between sort of 10 at night and 6 in the morning. They must poo regularly. So experts fashion these good mother myths, but then they are sort of exploited by a series of actors. So obviously kind of commercial interests. So I mean, there's so much money around sort of
Is
babies
this
and
big
newborns.
milk?
Yeah, because babies don't actually need very much with the amount of money you can spend on stuff your baby. So there's this around stimulation. There's so many different toys you can buy. Like, this is for cognitive stimulation, this is for physical stimulation. Politically, these myths are exploited as well, and that's one of the stories I've told in my book. If we go back over a century, child mortality was very high. Sort of 1 in 4 children wouldn't make it to adulthood, which is just extraordinary to think about now. And thank goodness that's no longer the case. And that was down to contaminated milk, poor sanitation, poor housing, a misunderstanding of how diseases spread. But it was all blamed on mothers. One of the quotes I put in my book, infants won't die because of poverty and poor sanitation; they'll die because of poor mothercraft. So politically, these myths can be really useful, and I've written about it in the book. I think particularly with the last government, the idea that you can sort of build babies' brains and sort of lift them out of poverty and give them better life chances. Well, that fits really nicely with austerity, right? Because then we don't have to invest in things. We can take away children's centres and youth clubs and all the kind of public services and public spaces that actually I think children and families need. So yeah, fashioned by experts, exploited by a range of actors, and endlessly mutable. You can come up with a good mother myth for anything, and they do often contradict themselves as well.
Well, that leads us into one of the hotly contested mothers myths at the moment, which is the motherhood penalty, and the
Yes.
idea that if you complain as well about some of the frustrations, you are an ungrateful parent. Where do you think the sort of stories about what you should be doing with your child and the problems if you don't do them fit into that broader? You touched up there a bit about the kind of politics of it and austerity. But is that unique to British culture, or is that something you found in your research? Like you say, that the idea of particular bedtimes was a US UK thing. Are we seeing these stories about women in particular cultures, or is it a universal thing?
It's a really good question. I think a lot of my research has been on the sort of English speaking countries like US, UK, obviously, but also Canada, Australia, Ireland, and but I think there is some evidence. I mean, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge that we do have this judgment in other countries as well. So Elizabeth Bandeter, who's a French philosopher, has written about this in the context of France, and the dynamics are a bit different there. But yeah, this kind of because essentially it's tied up with misogyny, and we have misogyny everywhere. And for me, these good mother myths are part of a culture where women are judged and blamed and shamed.
So it's the idea that like it's misogyny and Diet Coke that brings the world together in one single song, which
Yeah.
of course then leads to the other question. When you were doing your research, did you find any good dad myths?
Such a good question. The good dad shows up. That's all he needs to do.
End of.
End
He's in
of.
the picture.
Yeah, he's there. So the only sort of bad dad stereotype is the deadbeat absent dad. So, you know, fathers operate under a credit model where anything they do for their children is praised, whereas as women we operate under a deficit model. So we're constantly like, oh, you didn't cook that meal from scratch, or you went out to work. You know, it's finding your fault.
You didn't do this craft exercise with 5 loo rolls and some paper tissues and a glue gun that everyone seems to have. I've never had a glue gun. Who has a glue gun?
No, exactly. It's that feeling of falling short, isn't it? Whereas I think men can just go, well, I don't want a glue gun. I don't want to have to, you know, do crafts. And I think, you know, as mothers, I think we should be able to say, actually, I mean, I have to say, I really hated doing crafts with my kids. That just was not my thing at all. And that's fine. You know, it's kind of like, you don't have to do everything or be everything with your children. I think fathers find that a lot easier to, you know, they don't have that sort of societal pressure. Anything they do is valued, and I would like that to be the case for mothers as well, that anything and everything that we do is valued.
And what do you think the impact on our kids is of these myths?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's something I have a son and a daughter, and so I've thought about it a lot from their perspective, and I think the ultimate good mother myth is the self-sacrificing, nurturing woman who always puts her children first, is happy to be with her children, is completely fulfilled by her children. And I just think that is a terrible role model for children. For daughters, I think we're sort of saying to our daughters that that's a model for how women should behave, and women should be givers and you know, and there to serve men. And I think for our sons, we're sort of, you know, we're teaching them that, yeah, this is how you relate to women. I think the other damaging aspect of these good mother myths is they can make women ill. You know, the link between wanting to be a perfect mother and sort of poor mental health is a well-established one. So it's really not in our children's interest at all for us to be unwell, unhappy, miserable.
And just tell us a bit about, obviously, so you were working for Ipsos, you're now working with mothers in that postpartum process. What has that been like in terms of applying the real world research that you've made?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I mean, I still work with Ipsos on a freelance basis, so I've still got those sort of two streams of my, you know, sort of working life going, and I see them as kind of informing each other. And I think certainly working with women postnatally, I mean, I've been a lot more sort of punchy in the book than I would in a postnatal group, because when you're working with women postnatally, your role is a sort of holding, facilitating role.
You're not sitting in the group going, put the glue gun down, pick up the remote control, have a biscuit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes I will say have a biscuit, but yeah. So it is about, and so I kind of talk about research and say this is what some research says, you know, but it is about helping people find their own way. And it is also, I think, about a lot of it's quite around that emotional support, I think. And that's a world where, you know, research is a different sort of world. So I'm not sure I answered your question very well, Stella, but I see them as kind of informing each other.
But isn't that partly the point of your research? There isn't an answer, and what people listening to this will be interested in is the ability and perhaps the research to be able to go and stop telling me there is an answer. Stop telling me that if only I was a better mother, my child would sleep at 7 o'clock. I would then be able to prep all the craft activities for the next day, make all these wonderful, mainly peanut butter based. That's what I find. A lot of these things all seem to have peanut butter in. Foods for my children, and I would also be able to keep my career going too, because I think what's really interesting now, it's a bit like the kind of life is too short to stuff a mushroom argument in the 1980s. I think there's a generation of women struggling with, hang on, I want to be a good mum, I also want to be a good friend, I want to be good at my own career and realising who I am, and I want my children to see all of that, and at the end of the day you are completely burnt out. on a, because you're trying to do lots and lots of things in an environment where all of them come with negativity, like you say, a deficit rather than a credit model. And I think there's a whole new generation of women who frankly thought a lot of these arguments had been dealt with, finding that we're not dealing with them. And it's interesting where you talk about, you know, where did these ideas come from? Where does that research come from? Where does that, it's supposed to be helpful advice, but actually it's feeding a kind of, you should be able to do this and you're not. It's a very individualized approach to being a mum. Have you had any kind of pushback from people from your research? People saying, no, you're completely wrong. From the big milk industry saying, no, it's possible to feed your child perfectly.
Yeah. No, I haven't actually, because I think people sort of intuitively understand that, you know, as I would sometimes say to people, you know, you're a sample of one. So, you know, what is there in a study isn't necessarily, you know, even if it's a robust, you know, sort of well executed study, it's not necessarily going to apply to you as an individual. And I believe there is widespread acceptance that we make motherhood harder than it should be. That women are put under a huge amount of pressure. So no, I don't think I have experienced that pushback, because I think we all recognise that things need to change.
And what change would you like to see happen? So if you had the opportunity perhaps to reshape the support services that are being suggested, what would the change be that you'd want to see happen?
Yeah. If I had a magic wand. Well, I think the Sure Start model, which was, you know, very much alive and kicking when my kids were little, so I kind of experienced it personally. I think that model of universal services with then targeted support for families that need it, I think that's the right model that we should be following. And I know that, you know, we have family hubs, and hopefully, and those family hubs are from 0 to 19, so that's great, because, you know, Sure Start was 0 to 5. So having those places where, and I think one of the really key things about Sure Start for me was it's a place for parents to meet each other, because I do think getting through all the difficult stages of, you know, babyhood, and primary school years, I'm in the teenage years right now, actually you can just learn so much from other people, and just sort of swapping experiences in a non-judgmental environment. So I think that's a key part of it. I think maternity services, we know, are broken, and so, you know, women are starting out on motherhood, often injured, exhausted, traumatized, and that is an urgent thing which needs to change. And again, there's kind of widespread recognition that isn't working. But I just wonder, how many more reports do we have to read of the unnecessary deaths and injuries of mothers and babies, because this has been going on for years and years now. So I think maternity services need urgent reform, resources reform. And I think that would be my sort of number one priority. Also, feeding support as well. We haven't really talked about breastfeeding, but that's a huge, you know, that looms large in the early days. And again, you know, kind of personally experienced that, Stella, haven't you? The judgment and scrutiny around breastfeeding. We really set women up to fail. We say, you know, breastfeeding is natural and good mothers do it, and then we don't give people support. We don't have sufficient research on why breastfeeding doesn't work out for some women. So it's a real example of where we set ridiculously high standards for people and then do not give them the support to be able to do that.
I found it very frustrating, because I thought, well, I'm going to try and give this thing a go, and all the kind of information I had about it made me think it was something that would just happen, and then it didn't happen. And then I got grief about, well, just give up. And I was like, well, hang on, there must be a happy medium in between where maybe if there is an issue, someone could help. And what you realise is it's become such a contested thing that nobody wants to have a practical conversation about it. I was saved by a local feeding group. I didn't get support from the health service at all. If anything, I got the reverse. I got your baby will die if you do not feed it immediately. And you're not capable of feeding it because you are a bad mum, because you can't do this thing. So you could be a better mum by giving up entirely. And I sort of felt very overwhelmed by it, very overwhelmed early on, that this was something that was on the list of like showing that you were trying to take this thing seriously, and yet I couldn't understand why it didn't work. And actually, I suspect I'm in the majority of people who don't find it something that comes naturally.
Yeah. And that's something which makes me so frustrated and sad, because it can really overshadow the early days, that grief, that worry, that anxiety around it, and this idea that it comes naturally. And it's and actually that is one of the things which I think is behind a lot of these good mother myths, this idea that we naturally sort of behave and feel in a certain way. But I think it's a complete con to say breastfeeding comes naturally. It's a learned skill. There's all sorts of things that can get in the way. Having the right support at the right time can make all the difference. And it's complicated, because I think sometimes for women it is the best thing to, for their mental health, it is the best thing just to stop breastfeeding. But it's that idea of being told, it's like, oh, you must, rather than respecting the fact that that's what somebody wants to do. And it's like, how can we find ways to make this work out for them?
I think what's really interesting about the research you're talking about and just that whole culture is, as you say, it's like kind of you cannot win either way. And actually, at the heart of that is not the issue about is this child being fed? It's what is this woman doing now?
Yeah.
And it's very gendered, and it's almost like we don't see it. When we set up this podcast to try and capture those very conversations and those very issues, they're at the heart of so many public policy challenges. Like you say, things like, well, what support? How do people get support? Those things get hived off in politics at the moment, often as lady issues, but they're not lady-led, which is a very different thing, because if it were lady-led, it would actually be about the research, as you're saying. It would actually be about what evidence there is, rather than, well, what is this woman doing now? We've got to try and get her to do something better. If you had some of my other colleagues sat here right now, given the research that you've done and the work that you've done, what would you want to be saying to us?
About breastfeeding, or just
about your research about motherhood and the way in which we talk about it, think about it, and it comes to define what then help and support is given to anybody going through it.
I think it's complicated and it's complex, and I think easy answers and easy solutions are unhelpful. I think the most important thing of all is putting the mother's voice and needs at the heart of any policy making, but also any individual support that's given. And I think breastfeeding is a good example of that, because we assume that all women want to breastfeed, and there are many good reasons why breastfeeding just is not something we want to do. Sort of previous experiences of abuse, traumatic birth, disabilities, chronic health conditions, all of these things can mean that breastfeeding is either not an option or feels unbearable, or both. And I know that in policy making and in politics, we have to have sort of simple stories and simple narratives, but motherhood is complicated, and we need to allow space for that. And we need to allow space for diversity and different ways of doing things, and to respect that, and to not be prescriptive, not say, you need to be putting your baby to bed at 7 o'clock, for instance. I mean, that's one example. And recognize, and this is a really obvious point, and I think it's one of the reasons why good mother myths are so powerful, but people really want to do the best for their children. And some of the discourse around parents feeding their kids junk food, you'd think that people had sort of had children so they could torment them. And actually, I'd like us to start with the assumption that people want to do the best for their children. And there are so many things that can get in the way of that. One of the things I've written about in my book, Alison Gopnik, who's a developmental psychologist, who's written some wonderful books about child development and bringing up children. And she talks about, it's not about building children, it's about building a nurturing garden for our children to grow. And so that idea of a nurturing garden and enabling parents to give their children that nurturing garden to grow, I think is a really powerful one. And we are so far off that right now. Because
you use the concept of motherdom in your work. What does that mean for people?
Yeah, so motherdom, it wasn't my idea to come up with that. It was it was a lovely woman called Cora, but once she suggested it, I was like, oh yeah, I really like that idea, because it's the dom, as in freedom, martyrdom. Dom means sort of state, dignity, condition. And so for me, motherdom is about the realm of mothers, the dignity of mothers, the condition of mothers, and how we can make motherhood better, not just for women, but for families as a whole. So kind of turning away from mother blame, turning away from sort of lack of support, and looking at what children and families really need. Motherdom's also personal as well. We have our own personal motherdom, and I'm really keen for people to feel that, to celebrate and value their version of mothering and what they're doing for their children.
And so if you've had your politicians in front of them and you said, look, realise this is complicated, what would be your message for the people listening to this, maybe at 3:00 in the morning with a child who won't sleep, thinking, but I've tried to put it down in the cot and everybody else says they'll go to sleep in the cot. What would be your message to anyone listening to this right now, either at the start of their motherhood journey or maybe a bit further on, who is wondering what all of it means? If the myths aren't true, what is?
So I would say to individual mothers, recognize everything that you're doing for your baby, for your children, because you are giving them so much love and care and protection. Don't focus on the things you're not doing. Mistakes are inevitable. It's part of being human. Don't beat yourself up about them. We learn from our mistakes, and our children learn from our mistakes as well. You lose your temper and you shout at your child, and then you sort of apologize. That's just life. That's about, human life is messy and complicated. So don't beat yourself up. Value what you're doing. And one thing I always say to women postnatally, well, two things actually. One is the misery test. So if something's making you miserable, then that's a sign to do something different. So Stella, if all the glue guns on Instagram are making you miserable, that might be a sign to, not follow those accounts anymore.
Get a stapler. Just get a stapler. I don't follow them. The algorithm is the good mother myth. It's pushing this stuff into my feed.
Exactly. You must buy this stuff. And then the other thing I always
big stationery is chasing me, I think.
Yeah, the big stationery complex. Yeah, blimey.
And don't even get me started on the people who make all the bracelets. It's like that is obviously a grift.
Yeah, that is such a grift. I remember my daughter went through that phase of we just find little loom bands everywhere in the house. Nightmare. So the misery chat. Then the other thing I would always say is, like, what do you say to a friend? And I think people are much kinder to their friends than they are to themselves. So don't set yourself such high standards. Think about what you'd say to a friend, and you're doing a great job. I bet the people listening to the podcast are doing a great job.
And we could always add a third to this list, which is have a biscuit. There's never a challenge in life that having a biscuit, as long as it's not custard cream, because they are the work of the devil. But apart from that,
have a biscuit and a cup of tea. Yeah,
always have the biscuit.
Biscuits are the answer, definitely.
Brilliant, Alex. Do you think you'll do a follow-up to your book?
It's a good question. I'm sort of thinking about what next. I originally wanted to write a book. The book I wanted to read as a new mother, so sort of have stuff on sort of sleeping and routines and crying, and so I still potentially might like to do something about that, but that might be more sort of pieces rather than a book. But I'm very fascinated by this idea of myths, and so I'm starting to think about poverty, which is something I've read a lot in my book. Sort of myths around poverty and how we've sort of thought about that historically. So I'm kind of making my mind up about it right now. But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I suspect it will blow people's minds as much as your book will now, to say, and release them from the peril of both the glue gun and the myth that you can get it right. Thank you so much for joining me today, Alex.
Thank you, Stella. It's been great chatting to you.
I really hope you enjoyed listening to this week's Mummafesto and getting to know a bit more about Alex's really powerful research and the reassurance that it provides that loads and loads of what you get told on Instagram and the Daily Mail is complete hokum about motherhood. Please do listen to the next episode of the Mummafesto.